It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mandy Savitz-Romer from Harvard. She's nationally renowned with her expertise in preparing students for college and career. Dr. Savitz-Romer will have time to take questions after, and be sure to order her book, Ready, Willing, and Able. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mandy Savitz-Romer.
Thank you very much. To lower that a lot. Let's see if I can bring it down to my petite level. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Bruce, for that introduction. I will tell you that it's always a bit jarring for me to hear, this is Mandy Savitz-Romer from Harvard. My grandmother introduced me until she passed last summer as Mandy Savitz-Romer, a guidance counselor at Harvard University, because so much of my work has been in the field of school counseling, and that's pretty much what I bring to my talk and what I'm going to talk about today. So as she walked around the nursing home and introduced me, I said to her, "You know, Graham, Harvard doesn't have school counselors, just so you know." So anyway, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you for whatever you did to ensure that I had a typical Minnesota welcome with the weather. I sort of gathered that this is atypical because even the hotel folks were a little grumpy this morning. So I took, as a Bostonian, took some pleasure in that. And I too am new to tweeting. So I have a handle, I think it's called a handle or a tweet or something. And my students are teaching me. So I hope to learn from you, although I'm a little interested in the prizes. So I might try to tweet myself when I'm finished today. I'd like to start just by acknowledging just the day that you have ahead of you. I have to say I have an opportunity since Ready, Willing, and Able was published to go around the country and talk with people who are engaged in college and career readiness at the policy level, at the school district level, from the university perspective. And I'm struck by how much here in Minnesota you all are doing to advance this work. And looking at the day you have ahead of you, I only wish that I wasn't expected a little later on in San Diego. Otherwise, I would spend the day. But I'm so excited to be here. Here's what I'd like to do this morning. I'd like to start with a very quick landscape of college and career readiness. I think most of you know all of this, but I'd like to make sure we begin from a shared perspective and point of view. Then I'd like to introduce what I have been writing about and talking about, which is a developmental approach. And what do I mean by that in terms of college and career readiness, and what I think that might mean for those of you engaged with this work at various levels, practice, policy, et cetera. And then I'm going to end with a few suggestions for what I think needs to be in place in order for schools, districts, and staff to embrace a developmental approach. So I'll begin with just a little bit of a story. I entered my professional career as a 9th grade school counselor. I was hired just out of my graduate program, and the headmaster, which is what Boston public school principals are called, said, "I want you to provide early college awareness for our 9th graders." This was in about 1995, and the idea of early awareness was still relatively new. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but I was pretty psyched to have a job. So I started my career knowing that I just wanted to engage Boston students and this particular group of 350 9th graders in thinking about college. And I was very focused on college at the time. So one of the first things I would do is I would bring about a class of 30 into our new college and career center. We had a terrific space. We had partnerships with local universities. And I'd bring them down there and I'd start by saying, how many of you want to go to college? And if any of you do this work, you could probably imagine all 30 hands shot up in the air. And I thought, wow, this is going to be a piece of cake. This job is going to be easy. So I talked to them about college, and I gave them information. I probably threw words at them that had no meaning to them, but I did my job. I gave them tons of information. And I thought, we'll see how this goes. Well, it didn't take me long to realize that many of the students whose hands were in the air didn't come to school every day. A lot of them didn't carry backpacks, didn't do homework. And for the most part, very few of them would sign up for the enrichment programs that I would tell them about, whether they were federal TRIO programs like Upward Bound or Gear Up, or they were college prep programs with our partner universities, or dual enrollment. They just weren't signing up. And yet the hands in the air told me a different story. Looking back, I realized that many of them aspired to go to college. But when I left my position and began to do more research in the fields of developmental psychology and higher ed, I began to question whether or not they expected to go to college. One of the things that I found is that students would come back after they'd leave and they'd graduate, and they'd say, "Miss, you never told me ... stick anything in there you want. You never told me this, you never told me that." I would walk them back to that said college and career center and say, "Do you remember when I stood up here and gave you that information?" But indeed they hadn't, and indeed it hadn't stuck. So it strikes me. We have so many good things in place, terrific initiatives, hardworking people, And yet, I don't know that we have seen the kinds of gains in promoting college and career readiness that we'd like to see. And just as important, I think we're leaving some students off the pipeline, some by choice and some because we haven't engaged them in ways that make sense for them. So this is the sort of beginnings of my work, wondering what happened to those students from the 9th grade on. Why did I begin with a class of 9th grade that had 350 students in it only to graduate 220? Only about 100 of whom went off to college. So my work more recently, I guess I could turn my slides on, that would be nice. There I am, this is me. My work in promoting a developmental approach comes from those early experiences. So this is where I'd like to begin. So today I'm going to talk about college and career readiness. And I begin with a picture of John Belushi. You all know this is John Belushi, right? Yeah, so my students think this is Jack Black, I should tell you. This is indeed John Belushi. And John Belushi in the legendary Animal House wearing the college sweatshirt, right? This is Bluto, if you remember. And he wears this sweatshirt as if college means one thing. It didn't have the name of their college, it's just college. And the challenge with this, and why I always start with it, is because when I talk about college and career readiness, inevitably people ask me some questions. They say, you know, Professor Savitz-Romer, do you think everyone should go to college? Do you believe in a college for all mentality? Or do you get behind the multiple pathways philosophy that your colleagues at the Pathways to Prosperity have advanced? And the truth of the matter is, I don't really know what's meant by that. I mean, college doesn't mean one thing. Career doesn't mean one thing. We have so many different kinds of colleges, public and private and for-profit, not-for-profit, land-grant, specific women's colleges, historically black colleges. So many different kinds of institutions that college can't mean one thing. It's also true that when we talk about college and career readiness, sometimes people generate an idea in their mind that college is the 4-year private liberal arts experience with the rolling greens and hanging out on the yard, right? Well, that is in fact not true. And when I talk about college, and I use the term college, I'm thinking about post-secondary education. I'm thinking about some post-secondary credential, because in fact we know that having some post-secondary credential is a gateway into economic security and stability. So one of the other challenges with this idea is that college at the time of National Lampoon's Animal House is very different from what it is today. One of the things that's different is that what was once the charge of largely school counselors is today a shared responsibility. More than ever, there are community-based programs that are involved. There are teachers who are leading advisories and engaging with students in college and career exploration and planning. There are parents and family members. There are universities doing outreach. There are so many people involved. In fact, not too long ago, I received my AAA magazine, and there were 2 articles on helping get kids into college. So in fact, everyone's involved, even AAA. So if I think about how many people are doing this, it raises questions for me about how we think about the work. Who's doing what? What do young people need? And so finally, when I talk, and I begin this talk, I start with John Belushi, I remind you to know that when I think about college and career, and when I talk about college, it can mean a lot of different things. One of the reasons that things have changed so much is because we've learned a lot about what it takes to prepare students for college. And this is the part I said I think most of you know. So I'm going to condense about 20+ years of research into one slide. Here we know matters. Academics matter. There's no getting around it, right? Cliff Edelman has done the research. GPAs are in fact the best predictor of entrance to and success in college. It matters. And in fact, academic skills in certain courses like gateway courses such as math matter. We know that students need to begin with aspirations, whether it's to follow a certain career or go to college, and then they need information and support in making those goals become a reality. They need specific, personalized support. We need it to start early. We need to engage them and their families. And we know more today, perhaps than ever, that financial aid, whether it's early affordability, knowing what college costs, whether or not students can afford it, and where to get money, and that we need aid to help them manage the costs of higher ed. Okay? We know these things matter. And as a result, a lot of things have happened. We have new policies. Many of you are enacting them here today. We have policies, Common Core standards. We have the PARCC assessment. We have much more attention to encouraging students to take early level math courses so they can advance to advanced math courses. We have the use of college placement exams in high school so we can sort of assess students' college and career readiness. We have so many improvements in K-12 and higher education through partnerships, through programs. Much is going on, the development of advisories, or what some people call distributed counseling, in which teachers are engaged in college counseling. We have so many programs whether they're initiatives at the school level like individualized student plans or programs that are designed to allow students to take college-level courses in dual enrollment. There's much in place. We've even seen some small movement with respect to Pell Grants and some standardization of the FAFSA policies. Indeed, we are making strides here. We have a lot going on today, certainly relative to where we were 20 years ago. So with all of this in place and the work that you're doing, why does it seem, in fact, that despite this, we still see gaps in who is falling off what I would call the college and career going pipeline? So let's think about some data. I'm a professor, so you might have expected I'd show data. I'm going to show very little. My students will be very proud of me. So let's consider 10 students who largely fit the description of low income, first-generation college goer, otherwise vulnerable or at risk of not succeeding on a college and career path. Taking together all of the research, we can estimate that about 2.5 out of those 10 will fail to complete high school. From that population that I described, 2.5 off the path because they don't finish school. About 5 of them will fail to attend college. They'll leave high school. Some will directly enter the workforce, others won't. Others will go into the military. And about 7 out of that original 10 will fail to complete college, leaving us 3 students out of that 10 completing college. So I look at this chart and I think about those 3 on the far right, your left, and I think, I know those students. Those are the students for me as a counselor who showed up to every program. They were in my office. They signed up for anything and everything. They were what I would call living and breathing college. They knew they wanted to do it. They were motivated and engaged to do it. They followed through. They were willing to sacrifice hanging out with friends in order to go to an enrichment program. They made the kinds of choices that set them up for success. But it's the other 7 that I'm questioning. What happened with the other 7? How and where did we lose them? Is it such that our college and career readiness strategies somehow didn't engage them in the ways that they needed to be engaged? Or were they just not motivated? Were they like my student Latasha, who I would chase around the school and try to get her to become engaged, only to have her tell me, whatever, miss, as often as she could manage? In fact, there were students who just didn't see themselves as academically oriented. So as I think about these students, I think, where are the gaps? Certainly we lose students across the pipeline. But even the students who go on to college are struggling. We haven't equipped them with the kinds of skills they need to be successful. Higher ed has certainly raised questions about K-12 preparation. And for a long time, we engaged in a debate where higher ed said, well, if K-12 prepared them better, they would do better in college. And K-12 said, well, you've accepted them, you should support them. I think we've gotten to the point where we say yes and yes. And today, that's a shared responsibility. So we need to think about, how do we set young people up for success in K-12 and on? Do they have the kinds of skills that enable them to be successful in the workplace, if that's where they lead to go, or in college? And that's what's led me to thinking about a developmental approach. When I looked out at the college and career readiness strategies and programs that were going on, doing sort of a scan, I began to realize that the majority of the non-academic work, so the not course-related or skilled, sort of academic skill-related, was focused on what I would call instrumental support. Instrumental support is the assistance filling out forms, creating college lists, visiting college campuses, or filling out FAFSAs and other applications. And while these things matter, what we know, and I think most of you know, is that this starts largely with seniors, to some extent juniors, and there's not really much for 9th or 10th graders to do, let alone middle schoolers. And certainly with federal programs like Gear Up, we've done a much better job of getting into middle schools and making sure that we're engaging students early on. But the majority of the work was happening with students so far in their academic career, 11th and 12th grade, that we were losing them. They had already foreclosed on going to college. They'd already foreclosed on certain careers. And as I'll talk about in a little bit, foreclosure isn't a bad thing, but it's bad when it happens with misinformation, or worse, no information, or no exploration. So we look at this and we realize that there's some work that needs to be done. I want to know why some of my students raised their hand and said they wanted to go to college, only every time I asked them to fill out an application for a summer bridge program, it got lost in the vortex that is the backpack. You might know this backpack. It is where things go only to never be seen again, right? We all know this. I have 3 kids. I now live with 3 vortexes. So why is that? Did that student not care? Was that student not motivated? She seemed motivated. She seemed to care. Nice girl. But yet things got lost. There was no follow through. And I think there's more to it. And actually, some of the work that I did after leaving my position was looking into developmental psychology and saying, what do we know about human development that might help me understand what was going on for my students. Was I missing something? And in fact, lo and behold, I think I was. So here's the thing about developmental psychology. It gives us clues into why people do things. So just like doctors need information about what treatments work for what illnesses, right? You go to the doctor and you say, I have a sore throat. They stick something down your throat. They say you have strep, and here's the medicine for that, right? Doctors also rely on behavioral health to tell them why patients do certain things and why they don't do certain things. Like why a particular patient wouldn't follow through on the exercise routine or take their medicine to keep their cholesterol down, even though that information was given. Because we all know, even though we have information, it doesn't mean we act on it. So my students had a lot of information. In fact, sometimes today people say there's an information gap. And I think, have you heard of Google? I'm not sure there's an information gap. I think there's a gap in how students hear it, what they look for, and how they use it, and whether or not they think it even applies to them. And so when I think about this man here, and he's got himself a donut, a sugary, sprinkled, frosted donut, and a Granny Smith apple, he knows which one might be the better choice. Just knowing it doesn't mean he behaves in the way that his doctor would hope he would. Just because we tell students they can go to college, they can be engineers, they can be scientists, and that they should, doesn't mean they're going to follow through on the information that they need to do there. So what can we learn from behavioral psychology? What does developmental psychology tell us about students that we could apply to college and career readiness? Because as interested as I am in the choices this man is making, what I'm really interested in are those 7 students who I've lost across the pipeline. Can I find out why people lose paperwork, why things go into the backpack, why students don't follow up on the steps that they need to take? So developmental psychology gives us sort of a little bit of a window into why adolescents do things, and if you know adolescents, why they don't do things. And it allows us to take into account the cognitive, the social, the emotional kinds of development that are happening at the same time that we are pushing a college and career readiness agenda, which is what I believe many of you are interested today. So Suzanne Buffard and I put together this idea of a developmental approach, and we put it in a book called Ready, Willing, and Able. Thank you very much, Bruce, for sharing that. And the idea here is that there's not so much a linear phase like you might think about development, but that there are a few developmental processes that have particular salience to college and career readiness. And if we knew about them and we factored them into what we did, we might be able to differentiate how we provide supports. I mean, differentiation is a very popular and useful strategy in teaching, and yet we haven't really applied it to college and career readiness. In fact, because we haven't figured out how we differentiate in that way, right? We might know that some students are eligible for federal and state aid, and other students might not be if their citizenship status is not in place. But how else do we differentiate? How do we meet students where they are developmentally? And so this developmental approach that takes into this account is grounded in research and theory from developmental psychology, and it's focused on the processes that young students are going through as they're young children into young adolescents. We focus on the skills they need to succeed, not just in high school, but beyond. We represent them as a cycle because they're connected. They build on each other, not so much as isolated things. So if you look starting at the top, envisioning and believing is really about identity development. It's about envisioning a future for yourself and believing, importantly, in believing that you can get there, that is appropriate for you. There's aiming, which includes motivation, setting the kinds of goals that you have for yourself, and then actually achieving them. Planning, which draws on research and self-regulation, or as some people talk about, executive functioning, and marshalling, which is about leveraging the support of family members and friends. I should note there are many other skills, and people who write about non-cognitive skills or metacognition would add other skills to this, and this was no way meant to be an exhaustive list, but there were a few areas that I felt had particular relevance to college and career readiness. We have not come to a great agreement on what this term should be. You might hear people talking about non-cognitives, right? Non-cognitive variables and their role in academics, or soft skills, I think probably a worse term. I believe that these are developmental processes, and I don't know if we have the right name, but I think we can still address them, even in the time being that we don't, until we come up with a better name. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about identity, motivation, and self-regulation, and how I see those interacting, particularly in the college and career readiness process. And I'll save marshaling resources for you to read the book, mostly just for time purposes. Okay, so let's begin with identity. So what we know about identity is that lately there's been a great attention to helping students build a college-going identity. Maybe some of you have used this term. How do we help students build a college-going identity? How do we create a culture, a college-going culture, where students see this as a possibility for them? The thinking behind this is that if students embody this identity, then they will have the aspirations and the desire to achieve those goals and the intentions, and that's not a bad strategy. Efforts to accomplish this include college months, college days, faculty wearing sweatshirts, banners hanging, in this case, an elementary school where each classroom was assigned a particular college. These young people know the song, the chant that goes for each of these colleges, and they really embody these colleges. In fact, I think the USC, the Mohawk, is somehow reflective of the mascot of that school. So this is a no excuses elementary school in which college is very deeply ingrained in the culture. And in fact, this is a strategy used to build a college-going identity. These are important. They bring awareness. They show students that their teachers and staff have gone to college or have pursued certain careers. They help bring into conversations future orientations and identities. However, when I ask practitioners what they know about identity development, it largely isn't about college sweatshirt wearing or pennant hanging. In fact, let me ask you a question. How many of you here have ever heard, by a show of hands, of Erik Erikson? Just heard of him. Because you might have taken a psychology class somewhere along the way. And Erik Erikson is a developmental psychologist who really began what we know today about identity development. And the reality is identity development doesn't happen because we hang up signs or we tell people they can do something. It's a complicated process. And if we look to this idea of just exposing to information, we see that that's not consistent with what identity development is about. So let me say a little bit about identity development for a moment. Identity development is so salient to adolescents. All the while we're teaching them and trying to encourage them to think about their future, they're trying to figure out who they are. We see it because they're experimenting with their clothes, with the music they listen to, with the friends they're hanging out with, and usually how they're spending their time. That's the process of identity development, trying things out and seeing, does that fit? Does this work for me? What happens when I do this? Do people still like me? Do I get in trouble from my parents? All of that process of figuring out who they are is salient for adolescents. It is, in fact, the most crucial aspect of development for adolescents. And all the while they're doing that, we're trying to help them fit a college-going identity into that. So what we know is that developing identity includes the process of putting together multiple parts of your identity. So what do I mean by that? You all are made up of lots of different dimensions of your identity. And people organize dimensions in lots of ways. Different researchers use different categorizations. I'm going to use one that I think is pretty basic and I find pretty useful. One is the groups to which we are members. We are female, we are male, we are white, we are Latino, we are of a certain age, we are of a certain religion, we might be of a certain sports team. I won't mention any, I'm from Boston, I'm just saying. So we have all these different groups to which we belong, and that's a part of our identity. Another part of our identity are the roles we play: mother, daughter, sister, uncle, friend, translator, provider, and these roles that we play in our families and in our lives. And the last is self-concept. What do we think of ourselves? Right? When I ask people to define their identity, they say things like outgoing, friendly, introverted, a good cook, a runner, all sorts of different things. These are all parts of our identity. Great. Why am I telling you this? Because for students, the process of forming a coherent identity is the process of integrating all those things together. And if they don't fit well together, students will reject one. If I'm a girl and I'm thinking about science, I might come to believe that girls don't excel in science, and I will reject that part of my identity. This is what it means to integrate different parts of our identities. When there's conflict or things don't feel like they fit, students will rule it out. So students who are low income, who are thinking about college, can foreclose on that idea because they see, I'm poor, my people don't go to college. Or I've watched the people in my family, they don't go to college, or they don't pursue careers. Work is about making money. Work is about a job that brings them a paycheck. It's not about passion or interests or talents. It's about a paycheck. These are belief systems and ideas about how we think of futures. Now, certainly, many of us have foreclosed on identities. I have foreclosed on many, including being a singer. Lucky for all of you. So foreclosing is necessarily a bad thing. Foreclosing means you've tried something, it didn't work out, I'm going to move on. I suspect you've all foreclosed on certain careers and identities as well. The challenge, as Erikson would tell us, and Marcia who would tell us, is that if students foreclose prematurely, like they too early say, that's not me, without exploring, trying, getting information, then we've missed an opportunity to help them build a future-oriented identity. And that's where identity development comes in. In other words, they need to come to see college going as coherent with other dimensions of their identity. However, the other place where we see young people experiencing conflict with a college-going identity is in terms of self-concept. Therefore, building a college-going identity has to include self-concept. So let me shift for a second. When people talk about a college-going identity, we've broken it into two parts, envisioning and believing. And the reason for doing this is because we've come to believe that we focused a lot on envisioning. We focused a lot of our programming on raising awareness, giving students exploration such that they can envision a future for themselves. I believe that's what my 9th graders were telling me. All 30 of them envisioned a future for themselves. It's the believing part of self-concept is where I think we have more work to do. Because this believing part is so salient, that's what I want to talk about today. Believing. The belief part of identity is believing that one's system and identity is consistent with the goal they have for themselves, that they actually believe this future is possible. Because you can want something but not actually believe it's possible. Have you ever wanted something but thought that's probably not going to happen? I can list a few, but I won't. So it has to include all these parts. And when students come to not think something's possible, even though they want it, they won't try. They won't make the effort. They won't try the things that you want them to try. They won't take the dual enrollment classes. They won't try in their coursework because why should I? I don't actually believe it's possible. And what I believe happened for me for many years is that I got a lot of students on the college-going bus. I persuaded them. They trusted me. They're like, sure, miss, whatever. They joined the bus, but they never actually believed it. And that means that anytime there was an obstacle, and for students who are first generation and low income, there are many, the first obstacle was a reason to step off the path. See? Just confirmed I don't actually believe it. So what does it mean to help students come to believe this? This belief system comes through self-concept, and there are a lot of parts of self-concept that I could talk about. The one that I want to focus on is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy I find useful because it is this belief in what we think we can do. So I'm going to start with the marathon picture because I live in Boston, and as you might imagine, the Boston Marathon is a very popular thing to talk about and participate in. Lots of people have said to me, you should run the Boston Marathon. I think they're crazy. So let me tell you why. If someone says you should run a marathon, the first thing you're going to think about is, can I do it? Have I ever run before? Will I finish? Will I collapse? Will I embarrass myself? Is it worth my time? There are lots of questions that come up. And so I use this as an example to think about what would make me want to run a marathon. I'd ask those questions. But whether or not I would then engage in the kinds of activities that are necessary to run a marathon is going to depend on whether or not I believe it's possible. I'll say that again because that, I think, is the most important part. Whether or not I engage in the kinds of things that would make that possible is going to depend on whether or not I believe it's even possible. Will I get up in February when it is very dark and cold in Boston at 5:30 in the morning and run? Probably not if I don't think this is really going to happen. Am I going to eat right and stretch and take care of my body if I don't actually believe it's going to happen? No, because I'm going to find that sitting on the sofa and watching Scandal is a little bit better use time of my time. So as we make these decisions, young people are making decisions. Should I hang out with my friends after school or go to the tutoring program? Should I play with my video games at night or do my math homework? Should I follow through on that paperwork that counselor gave me about that summer program? No, because why am I going to apply? I'm probably not going to get in. That thought process, those cognitive processes stem from a cognitive judgment about what they think is possible, and that's where self-efficacy comes in. It's one's belief in their ability to accomplish a certain task. Do I believe I can do it? And related, and perhaps just as important, is do I believe I can persist if there's an obstacle? So, yeah, maybe I could get accepted to college, but do I think I could actually do it if it's hard when I'm there? This is where self-efficacy becomes very useful. It's domain specific. What does that mean? Self-esteem, as an example, is global. People have high self-esteem, low self-esteem. Self-efficacy is specific to certain domains. That is, students have specific college-going or career-oriented self-efficacy. So we all have self-efficacy in different areas. Some of you like to cook, maybe. People here cook? I'd like to know because I'd like to find you afterwards, okay? So I have very low self-efficacy when it comes to cooking. I follow recipes to the T. I mean, I'm the measuring spoon and I'm leveling it off because God forbid there be a little iota too much baking soda. And I don't actually have a lot of confidence that it's going to turn out well. So I do these things. And to be honest, I don't do it a lot. Why? Because I don't think it's going to be very good. Takeout is pretty accessible, and I'm lucky my husband cooks. People have high self-efficacy in math, or in writing, or in leadership. I also have low self-efficacy when it comes to directions. I would be lost without my iPhone. It once died when I was in a different city, and I pretty much called a cab. What does that mean? It means that if I don't believe I can do something, I'm not going to try. I'm not going to engage in the kinds of things to make that happen, and this is where self-efficacy is useful to us. How do we build self-efficacy in students? How do we help them see in their ability, not just their envisioning, not just their desire, their aspiration, but in their belief that this can happen? Well, here's what scientists would say about self-efficacy. What shapes it? The first is mastery of experience, doing something. So for me, should I run the marathon? Well, I have run a 5K, and I did not collapse. Not bad. Okay, this mastery of experience is why things like dual enrollment are so important. It gives students an opportunity to do something, to try it, and use that experience to inform their self-efficacy. When does it backfire? It backfires when they don't have a positive experience, and they use that experience to inform their self-efficacy. What does that mean? It means we need to be really mindful about how students make meaning of those experiences. What do they take away? What do they attribute their lack of success in that dual enrollment or college level course? It's why students need to try different career paths through internships. So they get to try things, not just the idea of being a doctor, but what does it mean to be a doctor? What does it mean to be an architect? So they get to try it and experience and form the self-efficacy. If we don't have opportunities for that, students miss opportunities to form their self-efficacy in these areas. For me, I ran it, okay. I did okay in the 5K, maybe I should try this marathon thing. The second thing is vicarious learning, seeing other people do it. Watching other people do things, even better, people I identify with and think are like me, might inform my self-efficacy. This, I believe, is why sneaker sales the day after any marathon are higher. I believe this to be true. I don't actually have data on it, but I am so certain that we watch people run the marathon, albeit for about 10 seconds, but in the 10 seconds that I see people run by me, they look like they're doing it pretty well, and maybe I can do it. I look and think, are they the same shape as me? Are they my age? Are they all young? And I make judgments, cognitive judgments about whether or not I could do that because I see others. That's why it's helpful to take students on college campuses, bring students from different careers back, and to show them these opportunities for vicarious learning. The third, the thing I think that most of us are really good at, is social persuasion. That is, people tell us you can do it. People say, yes, you can do it. I believe in you. I see talent in you. This is my husband, a glass half full guy. There is only good things. Of course you can do it. Why couldn't you run a marathon? Pushing, 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 right? Social persuasion. And the last is affect or an affective state. And this one's perhaps the most complicated, but it basically implies that if I'm in a positive state of mind, if I'm healthy, if I'm in a good place to make a cognitive judgment, then my self-efficacy will be strengthened. And this gets hard because for low-income students and those who are first in their family to go to college, oftentimes they've experienced some trauma or stress that makes this difficult. But what I would say is that if we know what shapes self-efficacy, we need to pay attention to how we develop it. Now, equally important are opportunities in which we undermine self-efficacy. We undermine it when we do things for students, not with them. I often talk with college preparation programs and they say, I think we're doing too much hand-holding. And I say, well, the stakes are high. I can see why that would happen. But when you do that hand-holding, you undermine the development of a critical skill and one that they need when they get to college. Otherwise, you set them up. These are important skills. So when we set up programs, are we ensuring that they are mastering their own experience? Are we making sure that when they see other people doing it, that they can identify with them? Not assigning challenging tasks, not giving students opportunities to master experience, and creating opportunities for students to try things out and to build self-efficacy. A few of the recommendations that I make, I've added here because you have the slides, I won't spend a lot of time on them, is that what we want to do is we want to support the aspirations and the expectations. If you took an audit of your programs, what's the percentage? How much time do you spend building awareness and aspirations relative to really focusing on beliefs? What are your students' belief systems about their future? Providing space to reflect on the multiple dimensions of identities. The complicated part of identity development is that it's invisible. Students don't wear a shirt that lists all the things that are important to them. We don't know what aspect of their identity is salient to them. We might think it's their gender or their race, but it might be their sexuality or their religious belief. And we bring panels of students to come talk to them, hoping that our students will identify, but we're making some assumptions about which aspects of their identity they're going to connect with. We need to find out from them. We need to have space for students to process the kinds of experiences to make sure that they're developing healthy meaning making or attributions about why things go the way they did. If you did well on a test, why? Students are sometimes quick to say because it was easy versus I studied hard. Those are internal and external attributions of an experience. The thing about identity development that I would add when it comes to this idea of meaning making is that a relatively neutral dimension of one's identity can be interpreted differently. So for one student, I'll give you an example of two students. Think of two students who are both immigrants to this country. One student, Ralph, has immigrated from Haiti, and he came here, and his story of coming here from his family was that we are moving to the United States so you can have an education and go to college and live the American dream. For him, being an immigrant and going to college are consistent. But take, for example, Hector, whose family immigrated from Ecuador. He has heard so much on the news about undocumented students not having access to college because of the limitations in finances. For Hector, going to college and being an immigrant are inconsistent. The same dimension of identity, being an immigrant, interpreted differently. That's where I think this invisibility is crucial. We have to help students share with us the way they're making sense of those identities, the way they make sense of who they are relative to college and career. Do they see it's possible? And the challenge with that for all of us is that takes time. It doesn't happen fast. It doesn't happen in a quick conversation. It requires that we create space and time for students to share what they're thinking about when it comes to this work. So let me shift to motivation. Of course, it takes more than just identifying yourself as a college goer or believing that you can do it. It also requires that you set some specific goals to achieve them, or as some people would say, you have the motivation to achieve them. So I'm going to use this idea of motivation as a term. I've worked in schools for a long time. Maybe you have as well. Maybe you've ever said, she's not that motivated, or he's not that motivated, or you've heard someone else say that. I've said that. We hear people talk about motivation as it's something either you have or you don't have. Someone has motivation. Interesting thing is that research on adolescents would tell us all adolescents are motivated. They're just not always motivated to do the things that we want them to do. They're motivated to do other things. So that someone is not motivated just isn't an accurate statement, right? They're all motivated. They're motivated to spend time with friends, to go to baseball games, to play video games, to go to church. That motivation comes from an internal process. It just is not the thing we want them doing. Sometimes it can feel like there's nothing we can do if students aren't motivated. Like, what can I do with them if either they want this or they don't? And that's where we lose those 7 students across the pipeline. Another thing that I hear people say with regard to motivation is that it's something we can give to somebody else. College preparation programs say, we like to give our students motivation for college and career. Well, if we look at the science behind motivation and the researchers who studied it, we know that those two things are actually misconceptions. All students have motivation, and motivation is not something you can give someone. Motivation is an internal process. You can't give someone an internal process. You can, however, set the conditions up for that internal process to develop. There is something you can do. But if we believe in the motivational speaker, I'm going to hand you motivation, and then you're going to want to do this, we're setting ourselves up for failure. It can't be about them giving students a single goal or a single motivational strategy. It's really about shaping the way they think. And again, like other things, it's more complex. This is how psychologists define motivation, actually what they would call adaptive motivation. They say that motivation are the beliefs and the goals, and I would underline those 2 words, the beliefs and the goals that drive action and the behaviors that are conducive to well-being. Now, motivation is certainly the thing that drives adolescents to do those other things like hang out with friends, right? Their belief and their goals about being accepted and being accepted within a peer group is motivated by a belief system that I want to be accepted, and their goal that people like them. But if we think about beliefs and goals, and we think of motivation in this way, then we see that our work is about informing those beliefs and their goals. So let's talk about the beliefs and the goals. At the heart of motivation are goals. Goals are what drive people to do something, whether it's everyday things like going to the market or buying a present for your partner or your spouse, to larger goals like running a marathon, going to college, becoming a physicist. But when it comes to goals, it's not about just whether somebody has them or not, but why they set those goals. The reasons that people do things will affect their likelihood for doing them incredibly so. This is true of attending college or choosing a particular field, that the reasons matter. And so for us, the question is, what are the reasons that students pursue college? What are the reasons that they think about a certain career? Research from psychologists would tell us not all reasons are equally as likely to get students to a college degree. So let me share a chart with you. Have any of you ever seen a chart or one like this? Have any of you ever used a chart or one like this? I will raise my hand. I used many a chart like this. Why did I do this? Because I wanted to motivate my students to go to college. And I would show them how much more money that they would make if they went to college. And yes, I would show this to ninth graders who would think that that professional degree was so far away they couldn't even wrap their head around it. Why do we use it? Because we think it works. But there are some reasons why this is not so useful. The biggest reason why a chart like this is actually not helpful in developing motivation is because money in this context is an extrinsic reward. And researchers who look at motivation and intrinsic and extrinsic rewards tell us that extrinsic rewards alone don't work. So intrinsic rewards, intrinsic goals are the ones and the things that we do because we have meaning behind them. They matter to us. They're internally driven. Versus extrinsic are we're going to get something like money or respect, some prestige, or I'm doing it to show off. Those would be extrinsic kinds of things, those extrinsic rewards or satisfying experience. And so when we look at this, we realize that we do lots of things for extrinsic reasons, right? There are lots of things we do. We go to work maybe because we get a paycheck, right? That's real. There are extrinsic rewards that we all use. I have twins and an older daughter. I've done potty training 3 times. Now, if you've ever done potty training, you know the only thing harder than potty training one child is potty training 2 children at the same time. What did I use? Marshmallows. The little ones that are colored, I used marshmallows. Every time they went to the bathroom, they got a marshmallow. Now, I assume none of you get marshmallows when you use the restroom these days. No, because we don't actually function like that. But I needed a hook. I needed to make them want to do it. Extrinsic rewards work. But on their own, they're insufficient. So what do I do? Because I am their mother, as much as they will grow to resent that, I would give them a proud hug after every marshmallow. Don't you feel proud? They were like, no, but I'll take the marshmallow now. Because actually, those intrinsic feelings may not come. They come in time. But we miss opportunities in what people would say, which is a balanced set of reasons for doing things. It's okay to use extrinsic hooks to get people interested, but we also want to help students develop the intrinsic reasons for doing things, because if we don't, and they don't know why they're doing them, they're doing them because of the carrot we're holding out in front of them, for the acceptance, that I'll like you, that you'll get more money. And what our research tells us is that can feel controlling to adolescents. And if you know anything about adolescents, you know they don't like to feel controlled. They want agency. They want ownership. So extrinsic rewards, not useful in the long run, can make adolescents feel bad. But we have to be realistic. Not everything is enjoyable. Maybe physics is not the most enjoyable class for a student, and you're talking with them, and you're trying to give them a reason to stick with it. Well, Desi and Ryan, who study motivation, have given us a third kind that helps us recognize that for some students, they may not like something, they may not have an intrinsic reason for wanting to do it, but they've internalized the value because of its relevance to something else that does have value. So no, I didn't enjoy physics as a student, but I knew I needed to do well in it because I had some other goal of going to college or graduating from high school that did matter to me. And that's where some of our work brings us. It's in balancing the intrinsic and the extrinsic, helping students find the intrinsic reasons for going to college, and helping them develop the internalized regulation, helping them see this may not be something you're intrinsically motivated to do. You don't have to use these languages, these words, but helping them identify what it's getting them, where it's taking them to. Sometimes that means drawing connections between what they're doing and their future, or the family member that wants a certain future for them. So there's a lesson on this from a book that I've read called Hope in the Unseen. Has anyone here read this book? Bruce has, great. So Hope in the Unseen is about a young boy named Cedric Jennings who grew up in Washington, D.C. He attended Ballou High School, which was at the time the lowest performing high school in Washington, D.C. And Cedric left Ballou High School and went to Brown University. And Ron Susskind, who was a reporter for the Post, chronicled this story of Cedric Jennings and his transition to Brown. And in this story, you read about all the difficulties Cedric faced in college, the academic ones, the financial, the social, connecting with peers, missing his family. And in that story, he talks about having a triple major in finance and economics and business, a triple major. I mean, he had these aspirations of this career in economics and finance. Well, he finished at Brown, and he went and received a master's degree, and he's now a social worker for DCF, Department of Children and Families in Washington, D.C. And when he talks today, and he goes on this circuit to talk about this book and his work, his book came out many years ago, one of the things he said is, I think if I was in college thinking about how that was going to bring me back to my community, I might have had a different mindset about why I was there. But for me, going to college was all about getting out. getting out of poverty, getting out of the ghetto, and getting out of my community. And that never quite felt right. But for him now, he sees it as his real motivation for doing things is about giving back to his community. And I use this as a lesson because I think that sometimes we miss opportunities to help students find things that matter to them, because they think they too should be driven by money or prestige or by having the certain bumper sticker on the back of their parents' car. And the question is, how do we help students develop those things? And then how do we help peers share those ideas across? Oh, sorry. I have an example that's 2 more slides ahead, pardon me. So there's a quote that I rely on that came from a study that some of my colleagues did on the summer melt, and that is the losing of students from the time they graduate in June until summer matriculation. This quote came from Karen Arnold and her colleagues. A student said, there's a difference between wanting to go to college and someone telling you they want you to go to college. Because when you go to college for reasons you don't know why, then you drop out because you don't know why you're there. You're going for someone else. It's like a promise you're keeping that's not yours. It's not your own promise. What I interpret in this quote is a lot about the reasons that people do things will determine how they do once there. Now, going to college to make others proud is not an inherently bad thing, just as giving my twins marshmallows for using the bathroom. Because in fact, we hear this from a lot of students, that their parents have sacrificed a lot for them to go to college and have a life for them. That's true of low-income students and other students alike. It, however, is not enough. It's insufficient. Students need to find the reasons that they're going for themselves. And that can take time. That can take them trying things out, identifying topics and careers that they're passionate about, subject matter they want to study. So in this area of motivation, the first being about goals, there are a few strategies. Again, it's really about helping students find their own reasons for going to college, helping them explore and develop their talents, figuring out what they're good at, where their self-efficacy lies, and avoiding the use of solely using extrinsic motivators, looking for opportunities for balance, making sure that we pay attention, whether it's in just creating a narrative over and over again about the pride, about the internal satisfaction of the things that they do, to help build that, and finally helping internalize the regulation, which means helping them see the connections between the things that don't feel valuable to them to the long-term goals they have. I'm going to share an example with you of how one school network, a charter network, took this idea. They developed a college-going tree. This is a group of 11th graders who were each given a leaf, and they were to write down why they wanted to go to college. And you can see the trunk sort of has CO on it. It actually says college. And they put it in the classroom. They wanted it to be present at all times. And each student wrote a reason on the leaf. Pretty easy activity, right? You need some brown paper, you need some green paper. That's really about it. And what they found is that students added things, that actually seeing their peers write about different things prompted them to find different reasons for going to college. There was sort of a peer regulation that was going on across. This is one way in which we can make these different kinds of reasons present for them. They may not feel it right away. My twins did not feel proud. They were just happy to get the marshmallow. But there are ways in which you can build those intrinsic reasons and values at the same time as students are talking about going to college. So let me talk about the second part of motivation. I said it's about the beliefs and the goals, and I've just talked about the goals. So let me say something about the beliefs, because the beliefs matter just as much as the goals. One way in which researchers have talked about beliefs has been in the concept of beliefs about intelligence. And here I would draw on the work of Carol Dweck, psychologist from Stanford. Carol Dweck has been writing and researching the concept of a fixed or growth mindset. How many people here have read something about Carol Dweck's work? Terrific. Okay, so you may know more about me on this. So the beliefs about intelligence, the idea here that Carol Dweck and her colleagues posit is that people's beliefs about their intelligence will determine how they engage academically. And she came up with these two types of beliefs, the growth and the fixed mindset. She believes and she argues that a growth mindset is held by people who believe that you can become smart, that you can work at something, and that intelligence is something that you can grow. And fixed mindsets come from people or are held by people who believe that it's a set quantity. You either have it or you don't. You're either born smart or you're not. And to test this out, she's done a number of interventions and evaluations, one in which has been most famous, which is that she took middle schoolers and she had a control group and a test group. And in the test group, she taught the students that the brain is like a muscle, hence my little image here. That is supposed to be a brain. But the brain is like a muscle, and the more you work at it, the smarter and stronger it gets. The control group, however, she just taught them a lesson about the brain. Nothing else, nothing about them. What did she find? Lo and behold, the students who came to develop or inherit a growth mindset, their academic behaviors, coming to school, completing homework, asking for help, and their long-term academic outcomes, GPA, promotion, and persistence, were much higher than the group that did not receive the growth intervention. Now, what I think is most interesting to me about this is that it turns out it doesn't really matter whether this is true or not. Some of you might be sitting there saying, I think I have a fixed mindset. It doesn't really matter whether or not it's true. It's the belief in it that matters. That in fact, it's the perceptions that students have that will shape how hard they try and how hard they work. Again, if I don't believe I'm capable of this, if my self-efficacy is low, and I don't believe I could get smarter, I'm not going to try harder. I'm going to take the PSAT, I'm going to get a score, and I'm going to assume that I will get the same score next time I take it. So am I going to work on that prep book? Am I going to work over the summer at trying to improve my score? Probably not. I might take it home. I might open it. But the truth is, I don't really believe that I'm going to do any better because I think my intelligence is fixed. I think I'm going to get the same score no matter how hard I work. And when we think of ourselves as adults, as educators, we can think about the kinds of mindsets we have. Because ultimately, the mindsets that we have shape how we talk to students. So researchers say that what influences these belief systems is really about how we talk to students, how we talk about effort versus ability. When students do well, do we tell them they're smart, or do we praise their effort? Do we tell them about how hard they tried or how hard they worked, or do we reinforce a fixed mindset by complimenting them on their intelligence? And the last is giving feedback about the kinds of strategies that students have used. I can tell you worked really hard to struggle through that test. I'm really proud. It's very different than saying, wow, you got it, you did it, because it emphasizes the effort. And when we do that, we grow more of a growth mindset than a fixed one. So these strategies come in sending clear messages about the importance of effort, but it also comes in making sure that we talk about how smart exists. And my daughter goes to a school in which they talk a lot about getting smart, not being smart. And this is a very subtle difference by how I was thinking about intelligence, even myself as a child. So these are some strategies for developing beliefs. So as we go back to motivation, again, is motivation something we can give a student? Can we motivate them to go to college simply by telling them they can do it? Probably not. It's an internal process. And the way that we inform that internal process is we set the conditions. We help them develop goals that are meaningful, that matter to them, that are intrinsically rewarding, and we help develop belief systems that shape how they're going to approach something. So the last concept I'd like to talk about is self-regulation. I revisit this cycle because we know that students need to see themselves as college or career material. We now know that they need to see themselves as capable and have a balanced set of reasons for doing it. So now what they need are skills to put those goals into action. They need the skills to follow through and the skills that we call self-regulation skills. So oftentimes when I talk with people about self-regulation, immediately they think of the maze that is the college application process. The forms, the deadlines, all the steps they have to take, all the dead ends and the frustrations of calling an office only to be forwarded to some other office. Indeed, this is true. It can be a very daunting process and one that requires a tremendous amount of organization. But self-regulation is more than that. And some of you may be very familiar with this concept. Some of you may refer to it as self-control or executive functioning. To be clear here today, self-regulation, as I think about it, is the ability to manage thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in the service of attaining a goal. And I include thoughts, emotions, and behaviors because thought processes can get in the way of following through on things. So what do they need? They need these skills. What are these skills? They range from attention and focus to cognitive flexibility, being able to shut down Facebook or email and focus on papers. I can tell you many of my graduate students struggle with that. Sometimes I'll walk to the back of the room and I'm shocked by what I see on their computers. I mean, one student was watching Game of Thrones. That was telling to me. I thought, you're watching a full show. I had a guest speaker that day, so there are questions for me about how students make choices about controlling and focusing their attention. Angela Duckworth, psychologist from Penn, who's most famous for her work on grit, which is very much aligned with this. She came to speak at Harvard recently, and I have a lot of questions about grit. One of the things that she says is that you can modify your situation if you'd like to focus on control. So she said one thing they do with students at Penn is she tells them, when you get into a class, you take the very front seat in the center so you can keep your eyes on the faculty member. What did I say to Scott when I first arrived? I said, look at how the front tables are all empty. We do this. We all go to the back. I do it too, just so you know. But everywhere I go, people don't take the front seats. And yet we know that when you can see people and you can track them, that you are more likely to be engaged. Now, we all have smartphones. We all check to see if we've got an email or a text or something. And this focus control is really difficult. But these kinds of skills, the delay of gratification, the planning skills, these are important skills. I mean, all of these are important skills. In fact, I have a colleague, Tom Hare, who works in special education. He always says, special education is just good education. These skills are just good skills. These self-regulatory skills, the belief systems, the self-efficacy, all of it. Whether you apply them to college and career readiness or you apply them because you're a principal and you're thinking about your students' engagement, they matter. In these self-regulation skills, I think we have a lot of room to grow. So what is this? This is the brain. The idea behind self-regulation, which really is believed to start at the front of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, is kind of like having a driver in the front of your brain who's helping make decisions. And this driver ultimately is what keeps people in control of their destinies and how they spend their time. In this way, we think of students making good decisions about how they spend their time, about how they organize, etc. There are other skills that come from this, though. But before I do that, let me show you an interesting thing about self-regulation. For many years, we believed that self-regulation were skills that we taught little kids. In fact, elementary school teachers are really skilled at developing these. They know that they have to teach kids, because otherwise, in the middle of every lesson, a child would raise her hand and say, "We got a puppy this weekend." Or they would actually just punch the student next to them when they said something they didn't like, right? These are regulatory skills, and we teach these to little kids because we know. But let me give you something to think about. As a parent, who do you think regulates my children's bedtime, food, and TV watching? Who decides that? I do. I am the regulator. I decide what they watch, when they watch it. I decide how much snacks and how much Halloween candy they're going to eat, or I decide how long they're going to keep eating it. I get to make all those decisions because I'm primarily the regulator. And as teachers in elementary schools also, we get to regulate things. How about college students? Who regulates when they study, when they come home at night, when they wake up? They do. What happens in between? We go from parents regulating, or trying to regulate, to students needing to have those internal regulations. And we fail to think about how we impart those skills to students. So what does it mean for the student who sits with me, completes the FAFSA form, and never mails it? Never mails it. It's done. Or the application that never gets delivered. Those are self-regulation tools. Those are absolutely self-regulation skills that students don't have. I sit on the board of a nonprofit called You Aspire. They do financial aid counseling, affordability training. I did a training on this for them, and one of the guys there, Adam, said to me, "Mandy, this is all great, but I'm talking with students for 20 minutes about the FAFSA and filling it out. Like, where does this fit?" I said, "Adam, well, let me ask you a question. Has a student ever come back to see you having not filled out the paperwork you asked him, or didn't get the parents' taxes, or didn't get the right paperwork for you?" And he said, "Yeah, all the time." And I said, "Well, what do you do?" He said, "Well, I remind them how important this paperwork is. I tell them that if we don't get it in, he won't be eligible for aid. I remind them that these are the kinds of things that determine," and he went on and on. I said, "Do you think the student didn't know any of that? Had you ever told the student that?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "So what made you think that telling them that again is going to mean that the form comes back?" And he said, "I don't know." And I said, "What if instead, when he came back, you asked him to replay his evening, where the form was? Did he remember to take it out of his bag? Did he give it to his parents and his parents say, 'I don't know what you're asking for, leave me alone'? What happened? How could he plan differently? What if you left that meeting, instead of telling him or giving him the same information you already gave him, you actually had a plan? What worked? What didn't work? And then he tried something different. What if you told him to send himself a Facebook message because you know he's going to check Facebook that night? Or if it meant sending a text to his mom to ask to remind him, 'I have a form for you to look at.' Whatever those strategies are, those are planning skills, and we need to teach those to students. What we see in this chart is that though we believe these skills to see the greatest leap around the ages of 4 and 5, we used to think that was it. There was no more teaching of this. But with much more research and literature on the brain's plasticity, we know that actually adolescents can experience more blips in terms of learning these skills. That is, we can teach these. These are not traits. You are not either well self-regulated or not. Yes, some of my students come to see me and their planners are color-coded and things are like identified with assignments and everything's beautiful, and other students come to see me and they don't even bring a piece of paper. Different, right? Some of us can delay the gratification of eating the whole pint of ice cream by just having a little bit. Others sit down and the pint is gone. We can all do this. For me, it's checking my email. I have to shut it off when I'm writing papers or writing things because I'll check it. right? But we develop these strategies for how to develop these skills. People have taught us or we've picked them up along the way. But there's a lot to teaching these to adolescents, particularly as they head off to college and they're about to be their own internal regulator. So let me give you some examples of self-regulation relative to college and career planning. The first is something called mental contrasting. This comes from the research of Gabrielle Ettingen and others at Penn that think about how people make plans for obstacles, right? Which is, can you teach students to anticipate obstacles by having them develop what they would call an if-then statement? For me, it is I know that where there is a teacher's room in Boston, there will be a box of Dunkin' Donuts. This is just because there is a Dunkin' Donuts on every corner in Boston, and you can't avoid them. So I know if I don't want to eat the donuts, I need a plan. Because chances are I'm going to walk in and I'll go right for the Boston cream. So if I know there's to be an obstacle, how am I going to plan for it? Maybe it's that I bring nuts with me. Maybe it's I say I'm going to eat it because I've been really good and I'm trying not to eat donuts, but it's my birthday and I'm having one. Or maybe it's that I'm not even going to go to the teacher's room. I'm going to avoid it. Or I'm going to have a plan, right? I'm going to tell one of my friends, don't let me eat it. Whatever it is, it's this idea that we can help students identify obstacles, whether they're in college or they're obstacles in getting forms filled out, or obstacles in remembering to come to a Saturday program, or an obstacle with dual enrollment experiences. If students can anticipate, that is a forward projection of thinking about the future, something that could go wrong, and have a plan, or better yet, multiple plans, then they can overcome them more successfully. If they don't anticipate them, when those obstacles present themselves, what do? They get frustrated and they leave, or they step off the path. That is one example. The other example is something called multiple pathways. This is something that's about cognitive thinking. So if you've ever looked up at a map, as I already mentioned, I do quite a lot, on your iPhone, ultimately if you put in an address, the GPS system will give you maybe 3 routes, right? Sometimes the first one will be the shortest, but they'll give you 3 different routes. We can do the same for students. We can help them see there are multiple pathways to the same goal. The idea being that there isn't just one way to get somewhere. Because if you take that one way and think of it as only the one way, when something goes wrong, you give up. If they go to college and the major and the career they had for themselves doesn't work out, they say, forget it, I can't do this. How can we develop the kind of cognitive flexibility that if I'm on a path that it doesn't work out, I can hop onto another one? That's what multiple pathways is. Can we help students see that there are multiple pathways to college, high school degrees, or passing a certain course? I think I need help. Let me develop 3 pathways for how I'm going to get help to pass this course. These are ideas behind planning. Some students, planning comes naturally. They are planners. I'm a planner. My husband, not so much. I'm a 3 steps ahead. He is 4 steps behind. But teaching these skills, planning, requires people to sit down and have strategies that they can pull on. The challenge is we don't know. We don't know which students have this capacity or these skills and which ones need help with it. And we need to assess that so we can give them more support. Finally, a self-regulation skill that lots of people like to talk about is the delay of gratification. And to this, I always show the slide with the marshmallows. Some of you are familiar with Walter Mischel's famous marshmallow study. Can I have a show of hands so I have a general idea of how much detail to give? Okay, so this marshmallow reference is in reference to a study, a very, very famous set of studies done by Walter Mischel, a Stanford psychologist, who wanted to understand the delay of gratification or self-control of 4- and 5-year-olds. One of the ways he tested it was by giving a 4 or 5-year-old a single marshmallow and saying to that child, I'm going to leave for about 10 minutes, or he didn't say this, I assume many of his research assistants did. I'm going to leave the room for 10 minutes. If you cannot eat the marshmallow, if you can hold back from eating it, when I return, I'm going to give you a second marshmallow, because we all know 2 marshmallows are better than 1 marshmallow. I should mention that many people have said that showing a marshmallow to a 4-year-old and asking them to wait 10 minutes is like giving an adult a cup of coffee first thing in the morning and asking them to wait 4 hours. That it is that hard, right? That the functioning ability of this child to see the marshmallow. So sure enough, he used one of those one-way mirrors. He would give the marshmallow, he would leave, and what would he do? He would watch the children. And sure enough, about 3/4 of the children, the person left the room, and they, of course, ate the marshmallow because they're 4 and marshmallows are super yummy. Well, he watched, however, and what he found was that among those who didn't, it wasn't so much that they didn't eat the marshmallow, it was that he observed them engaging in a set of strategies to avoid eating the marshmallow, that he actually noticed them doing things. Some kids turned the chair around so they didn't see the marshmallow. They changed the situation. They changed the situation. If I don't see the marshmallow, I won't want to eat it. They regulated their environment. Some students sang songs. to make the time go by. I mean, if you watch them, there are lots of videos on YouTube about this, some like parents doing it to their children. Don't do this to your children. It's just not nice. There are other ways to see how their delay of gratification skills are. So they watched this. They found some students actually, some children picked up the marshmallow and smelled it a little bit, like, because that's not eating it. It's just smelling it. It satisfied them, so they got a little taste in a way. So there were a set of these skills. Now, what did he find? In fact, that there were some kids who had these skills and others who ate the marshmallow. More importantly, he followed for many years on these students and found that their long-term outcomes, their academic outcomes, their health outcomes, all better. In fact, Angela Duckworth's research and many of her colleagues are finding that self-control is a better predictor of a host of outcomes, academic and health, over intelligence. More predictive of academic outcomes than intelligence. Think about that for a second. Self-control is more predictive of academic outcomes than intelligence, then why aren't we spending our school days on self-control? I mean, let's teach kids how to do this. Let's not assume they all have the same skill level. So there are questions in this. If we know this matters, and we know that delaying gratification is hard, right? It's hard for all of us. Sometimes when I do trainings on this topic, I put M&Ms on the tables and ask people not to eat them until I get to this point in the talk, which if you're paying attention to time, I'm about 3/4 of the way through, if not longer. This is a hard skill. Now we're asking 9th graders to give up time with family or friends to do enrichment programs for some bit of gratification that's going to come when? 4 years later? Or if we look at that chart, 8 years later? When is this going to pay off? And as we know with technology, the delaying of gratification is only getting harder and harder. We can teach students self-control. We can teach them to delay gratification. We can build sub-goals. We can help them make progress towards things. We can celebrate progress earlier on. There are lots of things that we can do. Some things we can do is pay attention to the fact that students have different skill levels in self-regulation, that they may not come to us equipped, that they may not come to us with the skills to remember to take out the form from the backpack and send it in, or that they may not have the organizing skills that come naturally to us or that we've worked hard at and have developed over time. We can provide a space for students to reflect on and process the plan for their future, teach them the ability to project forward. If this is not something they do, let's take the time to have them map out the steps. For some students, it's having a checklist. Individualized student plans is kind of this. It's mapping out their 4 years of high school and having steps along the way. But even some of the steps in a single year can feel too big. Breaking those down into sub-goals and sub-steps will help students who don't otherwise have the kinds of regulatory skills that we're talking about. Emphasizing multiple pathways thinking, as I said, is a way of just teaching a cognitive flexibility. If something doesn't work out, it doesn't mean it's over. It doesn't mean game over the way game over used to flash on the video screen after Pac-Man. I wouldn't say that to my grad students. They wouldn't know what Pac-Man is. But I feel like I can say it here. So there's a question about how students come to believe that it's not over when things go wrong. These are just tough things. And I have the persistence to work through them. I have the skills and I have the belief system that I can. So again, those three, identity, motivation, and self-regulation, those are three developmental processes that I believe have direct relevance and salience to college and career readiness. I think those are the skills that the students in that 9th grade class needed to help get them from aspiring to go to college to believing and being able to follow through on the tasks that I had asked them to do, to make the kinds of choices about their time and their energy that even though it would take a long time for them to feel satisfied or gratified with, they would choose to do. So what do I think needs to be in place in order for this to happen? These conditions that I think foster a developmental approach. I think too often we think students need these skills and that it's not our job to teach them, and actually that's just simply not true. It's why I think using terms like soft skills are detrimental to advancing this work. The good news is everything I've talked about today is teachable. I don't believe any of these things are traits or are fixed. I believe these are all things that we can teach students. I believe we have to start early. I don't believe we can teach these things to seniors and juniors. I think we start by middle school at the latest, but the truth is these skills develop early in elementary school. I did a training with middle school teachers recently. At the very end, one of the teachers came up to me and said, so this really isn't about college and career readiness at all. Like I could do all of this and not even talk about college. And I said, pretty much. You build these foundational skills, then all the other things will come. These are skills that are predictive of dropping out. These are skills that promote healthy academic engagement, but also healthy social engagement, avoiding risky health behaviors. I believe that we have to develop a school-wide vision. I think that oftentimes we might develop self-efficacy in one context and undermine it in another. We see this in schools that partner with community-based agencies sometimes. I hear from schools that we do this one way, they do it a different way. We need to get on board with a way of thinking about college and career readiness, a mindset, a belief system that is shared among all the adults working on this. Articulating roles and responsibilities. As I started, much of the college and career readiness work has been focused on what I call instrumental tasks, the filling out of forms, the tutoring, the applications, and hasn't focused on this. And yet what I'm suggesting today is do more. Now, how crazy am I to stand up with a bunch of educators and say, do more, as if you have this block of 2 hours in your day that you just otherwise were not filling? So one of the things about this is thinking about how this isn't about more, it's about different. I think it's about language we use. I think it's about talking with students differently. I think it's about realizing that after a college visit, I need to check in and see how students made meaning of the fact that they didn't see anyone who looked like them on that college campus. Because if I don't check in with them, they might make some meaning of that, only to undermine all the other initiatives I have ready to employ with them. That's going to require thinking differently about the things we're already doing. That's not more, that's just different. Or it means assigning roles and responsibilities. What is the role of teachers? What is the role of families? What is the role of your community-based programs or your university outreach programs? And what do your school counselors do? If everyone is working on the same slice of the pie and no one's paying attention to development, we've missed an opportunity. Certainly, I believe we need all hands on deck, but I think we need strategic hands on deck and intentionality about who's doing what. We need to dedicate time for processing. And lastly, the last bullet is, I believe, and I say this in a state where I realize the caseloads are high, the investment in school counselors is critical. As I leave today, I'll transition to San Diego to meet with the First Lady's Reach Higher team. The White House is investing largely in school counselors and figuring out how school counselors and schools could better leverage their college and career readiness efforts. I believe this is something that needs to happen if the other initiatives in place will work. As the federal government introduces things like net price calculators and college rating systems, I have a question. Who mediates those things? Who's the one who gets those into the hands of parents and students? It's the college advisors, the counselors. If those things are to be effective, we have to invest in the human capital to be able to utilize them. In a state like Minnesota, in a place where you are investing in individualized student plans, those plans are crucial. I believe they have the potential to be really effective. But if they're not done well, if they're not done with attention to personalizing and making sure they're paying attention to students and how they're going to reach those benchmarks that are written into them, we've undermined a very important initiative. We've undermined its own effectiveness. So I'll end by saying this. If you walk into the classroom which I teach, you'd see a lecture hall or you'd see big tables. You'd see a classroom that's set up for graduate students, adults age 22 and onward. When I walk into my 5-year-old twins' kindergarten classroom, I see something different. We wouldn't organize those two classrooms the same way. Why? Because they're of different ages and different cognitive abilities. We don't teach and talk to students the same way. When I train my counseling students to talk about confidentiality, with adolescents we say everything's confidential. With children we say it's a secret and I won't tell anybody, right? We do things differently because of their developmental readiness. The same is true of college and career readiness. Just because students come to us at the same chronological age does not mean they have the same developmental capacity to utilize and to make use of the initiatives that you already have in place. In order to differentiate, we have to take into account their identities, how they see themselves, their self-efficacy, their goals, the reasons they set them, the belief systems they have about intelligence, and the regulatory skills that will enable them to put their goals into action. I think paying attention to those kinds of things will help us engage a group of young people who are ready for college and career readiness. So thank you very much. Hi.